you guys, welcome back to Flickers of Fear. So, every once in a while, to get ideas for these reviews, these videos, I'll kind of go and browse through various internet lists of kind of like underrated, underseen horror films, usually looking for an older movie that I haven't seen before or that is recommended, right? So, the other day, I was actually doing one of these browsing sessions, and I stumbled across a 1977 movie. I think it's 1977, although some dates say 1975, so I'm not real sure. And this movie, I had not only never seen it, but I'd never even heard anyone mention it at all, ever, like in my entire life, which that's a very unusual thing to happen. Because even though, I mean, there's a lot of movies, like even from the 70s and 80s and stuff like that, that I haven't seen, but I've usually at least heard of them, and it's like on my list. This one I had actually never heard of. Now, this movie was actually, I believe it was initially released like at a pretty small like production company, and the title was initially False Face, but it's better known today as Scalpel. Now, this was directed by John Grissmer. I guess is how you pronounce his last name. He's probably best known, I think, for like the 1987 movie Blood Rage, which I actually have heard of, but that's the only movie that he had done that I had heard of. I had not heard of this one, so I was like, well, I'm gonna go check that out. Now, I assumed, just from like a quick read through of the synopsis, that this was gonna be something along the lines of, you know, like Eyes Without a Face, the George Franju movie, or Jess Franco's The Awful Dr. Orloff. Like, this is kind of a similar plot. And I was partially right, but this movie, Scalpel, actually has something of like a Southern Gothic angle to it, which actually I really dug. Now, the subject matter is pretty lurid, and I will say it kind of strains credulity, like at times. And also the main protagonist is an unapologetic shitheel of like the highest order. Like, seriously, he's the worst. But honestly, like all of these things, when I say them, it sounds like I'm being negative, but I'm absolutely not, because these things were actually, I think, probably my favorite things about the movie. Now, I'm actually not sure if the version that I watched, which somebody had uploaded to YouTube in really nice quality, I think this is maybe on Prime Video too. I'm not really sure. You'd have to check. So I'm not sure if this version had been edited for content. I heard that it was. Because I did hear that the original film, like the theatrical cut, like had more nudity in it. This doesn't really have any nudity other than like some side boob, I think was like the only thing that you saw. But this version that I saw does have some gore in it. Nothing like over the top. It's mostly like surgical type gore, but some of it's like pretty gnarly, at least for the time. Now, so I'm not really sure what the deal is. I'm not sure if I saw like an edited cut or whatever. It didn't really seem like an edited cut to me, so, but I just thought I'd bring that up because I saw somebody else mention it. I believe this movie did get a VHS release back in the day, and it was shown on television. But as far as I know, it was never even released to DVD. So it's remained like pretty obscure since it came out, which is kind of a shame, I'm going to say. Like, it's not really a lost masterpiece or anything like that. Like, I'm not going crazy, but it's pretty damn good. And it has like some really good acting performances, especially the two leads, who I really thought did a great job. So Robert Lansing, who I recognize from Empire of the Ants. He was also in some of the episodes of like the original Star Trek. He plays this plastic surgeon named Dr. Philip Reynolds. Now, from the very beginning of the movie, you get a pretty clear sense that this doctor is a little bit of a psychopath, maybe, you know? But to Robert Lansing's credit, he plays this character with just this real, like a lot of restraint and a lot of subtlety, and you almost can't help but like the guy, even though he's terrible. You know what I mean? He doesn't come across like as this arrogant, like cackling over the top villain. He's actually like pretty subtle, and I think that works really, really well. So not long into the movie, we find out that Philip's wife has died in a supposed accident, which wasn't an accident at all, as you'll discover, and that he has a grown daughter, like in her 20s or something like that, whose name is Heather. Heather is played by Judith Chapman. She was on a fuck ton of like soap operas back in the day. Beautiful girl. I think she's related to another actress that's kind of famous too. Now, so the daughter, Heather, she ran away from home a year previously and hasn't really contacted anybody in the family since then. Now, in a flashback sequence, we discover that the reason that the poor girl took off is that her dad, the plastic surgeon, caught her and her boyfriend having sex, and then dad drowned the boyfriend like in a pond on the property, and he made it look like an accident again, like he was like, oh, the kid was drunk and he must have just fallen in, too bad, so sad. It was that kind of thing. But Heather kind of saw most of the shit happen, so she knows what's what. So obviously she needed some time alone to like process that shit, you know what I mean? Oh, hey, my dad murdered my boyfriend, awesome. So it was just kind of like that. So she just took off, So Philip has this very wealthy father-in-law who always, correctly, as it turns out, blamed Philip for his daughter's death, like for, Philip killing his wife accidentally, like I said. Now, the father-in-law croaks, and in his will, he leaves absolutely bupkis to Philip or to his own son, whose name's Bradley. So Bradley is also Philip's brother-in-law, yeah. Now, he does, however, leave a whopping $5 million to his beloved granddaughter, Heather. Of course, the only problem about that is nobody knows where the fuck Heather is, and she's been gone for a year. Now, fortuitously, Philip and Bradley are driving around one night, kind of like commiserating and like whining and stuff about getting shafted in the old coot's will, as they both did, when kind of opportunity jumps up and smacks them in the face. So there's this stripper at a club who's getting her face absolutely caved in by this big ass bouncer for reasons which are never explained, but which it's not really important. But this scene is actually like pretty brutal. Like he's basically just like bashing her face like into a concrete wall like over and over, and her head is just like just a mass of bloody pulp like at the end. So it's pretty fucked up. So this young woman obviously, has a horrible head injury and she can't really see and stuff like that. So she staggers out into the street and happens to collapse right in front of Philip's car. So Philip and Bradley, like obviously as you would, they both get out of the car and they rush to help her, and they take her to the nearest hospital, which happens to be the hospital where Philip works, and they start kind of like getting her sorted out, you know what I mean? Now Philip, despite his shittery, does actually seem to want to help this woman, who's called Jane Doe, like for the rest of the movie. However, when he realizes that she doesn't really remember who she is, and she doesn't seem to have any family or friends or anything that are looking for her, the doctor hits upon a slightly unethical scheme. Let's call it that. He figures that since he had absolutely no idea, like, what this woman looked like before she got all her shit pushed in, he might as well reconstruct her face to look exactly like the face of his daughter Heather. And while he's at it, also might as well train her to talk like Heather and act like Heather. All the better to claim that $5 million, which was left to Heather by her dead grandfather. So obviously, because this girl's face was pretty much destroyed, the recovery process takes a while. And initially, Jane Doe here is pretty skeeved out by this doctor and all of his sketchy machinations, you know what I mean? However, he is eventually able to persuade, strong-arm her, kind of, into splitting the $5 million with him, even though he's like a completely leering creep. But she was working as a stripper. It's implied that she didn't have that great of a life up to this point. They don't really go into it, but you know what I mean? And so she's like, okay, $5 million, I guess I'll put up with this shit and do all of this sketchy shit that you're asking me to do. So Philip takes Jane back to his house so she can finish healing up. And then he also starts instructing her on how to be Heather. Like, he plays her recordings of Heather's voice, like he makes Jane copy samples of her handwriting, and he does like all these like quizzes about like all of the relatives, like, because like, all of these people, you're gonna have to meet them and shit like that. And it's this huge, like, very southern, very old money type of family. Like, this was shot and is set in Georgia, so it's very old South, you know what I mean? Everyone's like, y'all come back now, you hear? And drinking mint juleps and all that kind of shit. So it's that kind of stuff. So there's like a 40 bajillion relatives, and she has to remember all of them and details about them and stuff like that. Because these are all people, obviously, that have known Heather all their lives, so Jane is really going to have to be, like, top of her game if she's going to fool them, Now, it turns out that Jane actually does a quite commendable job, gonna say, of imitating Heather, and seems to be able to pass for, Philip's missing daughter, obviously. Her only big downfall, and they didn't really have time to address this, obviously, is that the real Heather is essentially like a musical prodigy. She was like a piano virtuoso. And Jane can obviously not play the piano. All she can play is chopsticks. Now, this almost gets her into trouble because there's this big family party, which is kind of celebrating her comeback, like with all the relatives and friends and everything there. And Bradley, the Philip's brother-in-law, he like insists on her playing something. It's like, and she wasn't prepared for it, obviously. Now, Philip is able to kind of get her out of this by saying, it's like, oh, while she was away, she had like this bad shock or this bad trauma, and she lost her ability to play the piano. But, the doctor says it'll be back and it'll be fine. But like, don't crowd her right now. Like, let her get over it or whatever. So that kind of works, but Bradley is obviously kind of suspicious about the situation, as you probably would be. Now, in spite of all these setbacks, though, Philip and Jane are able to successfully convince the family lawyers to hand the inheritance over to Jane, the whole $5 million. And just as they planned, she immediately like makes a gift of half the money to Philip. Like she says, oh, I always thought that granddaddy was so mean to him. And it's just like, so I want to give half my money to my daddy and all that kind of stuff. So then the pair of them return back to Philip's, palatial mansion, which is implied was actually the grandfather's house initially. So I guess like when Philip married the wife that he killed, like they moved into the house, but it's like a really nice, like it's a mansion essentially, like a big, like a big Southern plantation house. So they go back there and they're like, woohoo, we got all the money. They go, let's go do something fun. They go to Six Flags and ride roller coasters or whatever. And oh yeah, they also start fucking. Which, ew. I mean, okay, so they're not related, obviously, but it's still pretty weird, like, for a middle-aged to older dude to start having sex with a woman who's not only half his age, but who's also, like, the exact clone of his daughter. Like, not only looks exactly like her, but also talks like her and acts like her and everything like that. I mean, that's weird, right? I mean, I think that's weird. Like, there's just so much to unpack there, like, from a psychological standpoint. And believe me, the movie does get ickier as time goes on. I mean, this is a Southern Gothic, and this is kind of, like, par for the course, but yeah, just... this isn't as gross as it gets, is what I'm going to say. Okay, so remember how I said that Bradley was getting suspicious about this Heather not really being who she's appearing to be, which, yeah, he's right about that. Well, he turns up unannounced at Philip's house one night when neither of them are home. And he just, like, lets himself in, like you do, sits in the parlor for them, and he's just, like, drinking their booze and, getting drunker and getting angrier and shit like that. Because... recall that because here was the thing. Not only did he think it was weird that, Heather can't play the piano anymore, like he thought that was a little bit strange, but you also have to remember that Bradley was with Philip when they found the stripper with the smashed up face. So Bradley is not stupid, and he is able to like kind of put two and two together and be like, oh, this is probably an imposter. Like he fixed her face to look like his daughter's face. You know what I mean? He figured it out. Now you might think that Philip and Jane are going to have to kill Bradley to keep him from ratting on them, right? But it turns out that they don't exactly need to. Bradley has like a heart condition. He takes medication for it. And he ends up at this particular night, like getting so drunk and so worked up about the whole situation that his heart starts to give out and he collapses. So pretty much all Philip does is he doesn't kill him directly, but he kind of holds his medication like out of his reach so he can't get it, and then so he just like stands there and coldly like watches him pass away like on the floor, you know what I mean? So again, this appears to be just simply a tragic natural death, you know what I mean? And so now the incest twins are supposedly in the clear again, right? But then a new wrinkle appears in the form of the real Heather, who actually shows up at Bradley's funeral, but she kind of keeps on the down low. She kind of like stays behind a gravestone and just like watches everything from afar. So then she goes back to Philip's house when no one's home, lets herself in, which, a lot of people seem to be doing that at this house. And she cooks him this big dinner, like to surprise him. Now, Philip is actually over fucking joyed to see his daughter at long last because he's really missed her. And Heather acts like it's not bizarre in the least that her father is fucking a woman who looks exactly like her and is like the same age as her and stuff. And I'm going to say that just like from the interactions between the father and the real daughter, it's pretty obvious that Philip had the hots for his daughter like all along, which I guess goes a long way toward explaining like why he killed her boyfriend the year before, because I guess he was jealous. He didn't want another man having her or whatever. Now, Heather says she was unaware that her grandfather had died and that her grandfather had left her all that money. So Philip actually just lies to her and says, oh man, that old bastard, he just left all the money to the local college. Nobody in the family got a red cent. Now, also, while that's going on, Jane is also starting to perceive that she's kind of becoming a third wheel now that Heather's back. And she starts to get concerned that Heather is going to interfere with this whole scheme that her and Philip have going on, because Heather is like pretty smart and she's going to figure out like what we're up to. You know what I mean? Now, mindful of Jane's anxiety, Philip actually reassures her, oh, I've hired a hitman to have Heather killed. And he acts like all upset. He's like, this is my baby. I can't believe I'm going to do this. But, you know, we have to do this because she's going to find out about us, blah, blah, blah. And there's actually like this great sequence where the supposed hitman, who's supposedly masquerading as a plumber, turns up at the house, like while Heather is there alone. And then it kind of goes back and forth between these two scenarios. So like, meanwhile, the other scenario is that Philip and Jane are out spending the day on the lake. And during those scenes, there's also a couple of kind of suspenseful fake outs when you think that Philip has actually drowned Jane like he did to his wife and like he did to Heather's boyfriend, right? But no, she's fine. And she actually seems happy knowing that while she's out like happily doing the backstroke in her little skimpy red bikini, Heather is being put out of the way permanently back at the house by the supposed plumber. Not so fast though. It turns out that the plumber was an actual plumber and not a hitman at all. And it also turns out that Philip actually hired a local cop to pull him and Jane over like on their way back from the lake. Then he pretends that he doesn't know Jane. She's just some hitchhiker he picked up. And then the cop tries to cuff her and she runs off. And then the cop starts chasing her. And it becomes pretty obvious at this point that Philip has actually paid a hitman, but it's this guy. It's this cop. And he's paid the hitman to kill Jane and not his daughter. Which, you know, Jane probably should have seen that coming. Not gonna lie. So we don't actually see what happens to Jane yet. But then Philip goes back to the house and tells Heather that Jane drowned accidentally, which, you know, seems to be a running theme with him, I guess. And now it's just the two of them. He then tries to rape his own daughter, which again, fucking ew. It's like, I told you it was going to get ickier. So you know what I'm saying? However, he is stopped from doing so when Jane pops up behind him and clobbers him with a cast iron skillet. Now, I'm not absolutely sure. This was slightly unclear, but I thought that the movie implied here that Jane and Heather had switched places for this whole scenario. I mean, I thought there were a couple of lines like implying that, which would mean that it was actually Heather at the lake with her dad the whole time, like that got chased by the cop, and Jane who almost got raped. Not that it makes the shit any better, because Philip still tried to jump on her, like thinking it was his daughter, but I'm just saying, I thought the implication was that they had switched places earlier, like off screen, so it would be more suspenseful, you know what I'm saying? But I'm not entirely sure if that's the case. So now comes the exposition. So while Heather was away that whole year, she was actually in a sanitarium. You know, because she went there because she was freaked out, because she's like, oh my God, my dad killed my boyfriend. That was, which, you know, you can't blame her, right? Now, the only person in the family who knew that she was there was her grandfather. So, of course, she knew that he had died, and she also knew that he had left her all his money. Now, Heather's therapist, while she was at the sanitarium, tried to convince her to report her father to the police for murdering her boyfriend, which obviously, but she evidently wanted to get revenge on him, like, in her own way. She's playing the long game, is what I'm saying. So when she came back home and got wind of the whole Jane situation, she figured she could use that to her advantage, I guess. So while Jane and Heather seem to hate each other at first, because there's like a lot of jealousy and stuff going on there, it seems that off screen and kind of subtly, they were kind of becoming allies. And I guess at some point they decided to work together to like fuck Philip over. So after Philip wakes up from getting his fucking head bashed in, Heather and her therapist are sitting there looking at him. And they very calmly, this was great, they very calmly tell Philip that Jane was a complete figment of his imagination. That it was just this sick fantasy that he had constructed out of his desire to bang his own daughter, essentially. The more they tell Philip this, like, and they're very serious and they're just like straight faced and everything like that, and they're just like, yeah, there's nobody there, Daddy, it's like there's no such person, and blah blah blah. And it was so fucking funny. So the more they do that, like, the more off the rails he goes, right? I mean, he wasn't the most sane person to start with, so it's not like he had a long distance to go, but I'm just saying. And at last, he's just reduced to this completely gibbering mess who just keeps seeing hallucinations of all the people he killed, either directly or indirectly, like including his wife, the boyfriend, and Bradley, you know. So at this point, Philip gets unceremoniously, like, you know, carted off to the asylum in a straitjacket. And then, in the end, Jane and Heather, which I thought was kind of cool, split the $5 million. You know, Heather's actually, like, pretty cool. She's, like, you know, she's got enough money. So she gives Jane the other $2.5 million. And Heather stays behind at the big palatial mansion. And they both end up happy and wealthy. So all's well that ends well. Now, as I mentioned, I don't think I'd go so far as say it's like an undiscovered classic or anything like that. But it is a pretty fun, a pretty riveting, and very, like, I must say, a very alluringly trashy, like, Southern Gothic horror thriller. Yeah, I kind of like the trashy element to it. I mean, Robert Lansing is just stellar in this as this kind of sociopathic main character. He's just charming enough that you can't stop watching him, but he's also a gross pervert and he's, like, shady as hell. But, like, you still can't, I don't know if I'd go so far as say you like him, but you can't stop watching him, you know what I mean? Judith Chapman, who plays Jane and Heather, I mean, she's sensational. You know, she has dual roles. She plays the characters really similarly, obviously, because, you know, one is supposed to be impersonating the other one, so they have to act alike. But she gives each character, like, real subtle little tells, so you can always determine, like, which one is which, you know? Now, as I mentioned earlier, too, it's like, I think some of the plot twists stretched believability a bit, like, especially toward the end with the whole switcheroo thing and this whole plot that they were cooking up, like, behind the scenes. But I'm going to say I didn't find it to be, like, too egregious or too out there, and really kind of exaggerated narratives like this are, you know, pretty standard for the Southern Gothic genre anyway, so it's not like it was anything, like, way out of bounds or anything. So I'm going to say, I mean, if you're looking for kind of just, like, a fairly obscure 70s horror film with kind of like some old South flair to it and some pretty gross fucking incesty family dynamics, so like I said, kind of Southern Gothic, this, you know, you might want to give this one a whirl. Like I said, I think it might be on Amazon Prime, but you'd have to check and see. But somebody has uploaded a really nice looking copy of it to YouTube, which is where I watched it. As I said, I'm not really sure if it was edited from the theatrical version because this movie's really obscure. Like I said, it did get a VHS release, but as far as I know, it was never released on DVD or any other media. So it kind of like fell between the cracks. And like I said, that's kind of a shame because this is actually like a pretty decent 1970s horror movie, and I quite enjoyed it. That will do it for this Flickers of Fear. Remember to like, share, subscribe, and comment, and I will see you guys again on the next one. Bye.